Welcome to Astrochemical Biological Framework, Advanced Terminology for Interdisciplinary Research, Core Principles and Metaphysics. First, let's look over archetypal isomorphism. The theoretical premise that patterns observed in astrological symbolism, planetary energies, aspects, signs, share structural similarities with patterns in chemical and biological systems without implying direct causation. For example, the archetypal isomorphism between Martian energy and oxidation reactions allows us to model corrosion as a planetary process. Symbolic resonance field. A conceptual space where a celestial configuration, for example a transit, and a material biological process are understood to be parallel expressions of the same underlying qualitative pattern. For example, the neurotransmitter release occurred within the symbolic resonance field of the Moon-Mercury opposition. Qualitative topology. Let's do that again without me writing over it. Might zoom in a little bit. All right. So the study of how the qualities of astrological factors, cardinal, fixed, mutable, hot, cold, wet, dry, map onto the properties of matter and biological systems. For example, applying qualitative topology, we map fixed signs to crystalline structures and mutable signs to catalytic enzymes. Chemical astrological terms. Planetary valence. The metaphorical combining power of a planetary principle describing how many and what type of archetypal bonds it tends to form in a compound or process. For example, Saturn demonstrates a planetary valence of -4, favoring structures with strict limits and defined geometry. Aspect geometry. The specific angular relationship between celestial bodies used as an analog for molecular bond angles and spatial configuration. For example, the trine's 120-degree aspect geometry perfectly models the bonding in boron trifluoride. Orbital harmonic. The symbolic correspondence between electron orbital shells, S, P, D, F, and planetary spheres or octaves of archetypal expression. For example, the F orbitals with their complex shapes operate on a Neptunian-Plutonian orbital harmonic. Transmutative catalyst. A planetary transit or configuration, especially involving Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, that correlates with or symbolizes phase changes, nuclear reactions, or radical chemical transformations. For example, the Plutonian ingress acted as a transmutative catalyst for the radioactive decay experiment. Electron synastry, the study of how bonding pairs and lone electron pairs interact in a manner analogous to planetary aspects in relationship astrology. For example, the electron synastry in this compound shows a strong conjunction of bonding orbitals with a square to a lone pair. Biological astrological terms. Celestial pharmacodynamics. The study of how the timing of celestial events, transits, progressions correlates with or symbolically maps to the action of pharmaceutical agents in biological systems. For example, the Jupiter transit correlated with the anabolic phase of the drug's action, fitting its celestial pharmacodynamics. Biochemical rulership. The redefined correspondence between planetary principles and specific biochemical pathways, receptors, or cellular processes based on functional similarity. For example, dopaminergic pathways have been reassigned to Neptune-Poseidon rulership due to their role in reward and transcendence. Metabolic aspect cycle. The mapping of metabolic pathways, for example, Krebs cycle, onto a zodiacal or planetary cycle, with each step corresponding to a specific astrological phase. For example, the conversion of citrate to isocitrate aligns with the 15 degrees Leo phase of the metabolic aspect cycle. Neurotransmitter dignities. The essential and accidental dignities of key neurotransmitters based on their functions, analogous to planetary dignities in traditional astrology. For example, serotonin has its exaltation in the parasympathetic state and its detriment in conditions of chronic inflammation. Epigenetic transit, a theoretical model where slow-moving planetary cycles, Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, correlate with or symbolically represent patterns of epigenetic activation and silencing across generations. For example, the family's Plutonic epigenetic transit over 3 generations showed methylation patterns mirroring the 248-year orbital cycle. Homeostatic horoscope, a chart calculated for the moment of physiological equilibrium, for example, recovery from illness, metabolic set point, used to study astrological signatures of health. For example, the patient's homeostatic horoscope revealed a prominent Chiron-Vesta opposition, pointing to chronic immune modulation. Process and methodology terms. You have symbolic titration, the methodological practice of gradually increasing the complexity of an astrological factor in an experimental model to observe corresponding thresholds in biological or chemical systems. For example, through symbolic titration, we found the Mars square Pluto signature only manifested in cell death after reaching an 8 degrees orb. Archetypal chromatography, an analytical framework that separates a complex biological or chemical process into its component planetary signatures for individual study. For example, using archetypal chromatography, we isolated the Venusian binding and mercurial signaling components of the immune system. Biological progressions, a predictive model applying astrological progression techniques, secondary solar arc to developmental biology, aging, or disease progression timelines. For example, the biological progression of the moon correlated precisely with the 28-day stem cell differentiation cycle. Astrochemical yield, a quantitative or qualitative measure of how strongly a celestial configuration manifests in a corresponding material process. For example, the astrochemical yield of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction was remarkable, producing both increased yield and more aesthetically crystalline structures. Synastric binding affinity, a conceptual metric describing how strongly two celestial bodies' symbolic energies combine to influence a biological receptor or chemical binding site. For example, the synastric binding affinity of the Sun-Mars midpoint shows strong correlation with androgen receptor activity. Emergent phenomena. We have the consciousness observer effect. The proposed influence of the astrologer researcher's awareness and symbolic framing on the interpretation and potentially the outcome of interdisciplinary experiments. For example, we must account for the consciousness observer effect when analyzing data, as our focus on the Saturnine qualities may have amplified structural outcomes. Morphic resonance signatures, patterns in celestial configurations that appeared to correspond with the sudden emergence of new chemical behaviors or biological adaptations, per morphic resonance theory. For example, the appearance of this novel enzyme across multiple labs coincided with a clear morphic resonance signature in the Uranian field. Quantum astro-entanglement, a speculative framework proposing that certain astrological correlations operate through non-local quantum-like connections rather than mechanistic causality. For example, the quantum astro-entanglement model explains why control groups sometimes show the signature's effect. Measurement and analysis, symbolic spectroscopy, the interpretive practice of breaking down a complex astrological configuration into its component frequencies, planetary, aspectual, harmonic, for analysis, analogous to spectral analysis in chemistry. For example, through symbolic spectroscopy, we identified the dominant Mercury-Uranus harmonic in the innovation event. Biocyclic Fourier analysis, a mathematical technique applying Fourier transforms to biological rhythm data to identify underlying astral frequencies in physiological processes. For example, the biocyclic Fourier analysis of cortisol levels revealed a hidden 12-hour Jupiter rhythm beneath the circadian pattern. Planetary half-life, the duration during which a transit's or configuration's symbolic influence remains detectable in a material or biological system after the exact celestial event. For example, the solar eclipse had a planetary half-life of 14 days in the cell culture experiments, gradually dissipating. And that is the end of this document. And yeah, this was employing astrological terminology as a qualitative mapping language, not a mechanistic explanatory model. And we'll see you in the next one, teaching you more advanced astrology. Subscribe and like.